Okay, so you're all very welcome to Social Justice Ireland's annual conference on Sustainable Development Goals on the UN Global Justice Day. My name is John McGeady and I'm the CEO of Social Justice Ireland. Today we launched the latest edition of Measuring Progress, the Sustainable Progress Index, our annual report that measures Ireland's progress in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and also compares Ireland's progress with that of our European peers, specifically 14 Eurozone members that have, for the most part, adjusted to European Union standards. Once again, we at Social Justice Ireland have been pleased to collaborate with Professor Charles Clarke from the Department of Economics at St. John's University in New York, and Dr. Catherine Kavanagh with the Department of Economics at UCC in producing this report, both of whom are joining us today to present. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for Q&A. So please, if you have any burning questions, use the Q&A function and we will address them following the presentations. First up is Professor Clarke, who will be familiar to those of you who read this report and join Social Justice Ireland for this conference or webinar each year. He will consider how well-being has been measured in terms of economic progress, in particular casting an eye on GDP as a metric of progress, and highlight two alternative metrics, the World Bank Wealth Accounts and the Social Progress Index, each of which provide useful perspectives. So over to you, Charlie, and we will screen share the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, thank you, John. Glad to be back. I know this is more convenient to do it online, but it was always much more fun to travel to Dublin for these events, but this certainly makes it much easier. I'm going to start off by illustrating the basic problem with GDP with a quick rehash of what's going on in the United States right now. Now, we have a presidential election, and besides the craziness of how old Biden is and how crazy and fascist Trump is, the debate we see by experts is the economy is doing very well in the United States, yet most people don't feel it. And so they want to try to explain, why is that happening? Can we go back to the slide? Well, we could just leave it here, just leave it here. And I think a good part of the problem is that the people who talk about it on television, the experts, they've all studied economics, specifically macroeconomics. And macroeconomics tells us that if the economy is growing, unemployment's low, and inflation's low, then the economy is doing well. And historically, right now, the United States has a good growth, very low, historically low unemployment, and inflation, if you're my age, is very moderate. It's only if you've only lived the last 20-something years that you think that it's excessively high or something you haven't experienced before. Yet, people are not being crazy or unrealistic in terms of their feelings. Their lived reality is different than what we study in macroeconomics. And that is really the main thing that drives this whole, generally called beyond GDP, research agenda in economics. Next slide, please. And so after mostly governments have measured things based on what they're interested in. When William the Conqueror conquered England, he did a survey of all that he could take and how many people he could put into an army. That's what was important for him. Similarly with Petty's counting of what was in Ireland after Cromwell's invasion. This is to pay off those who invested in it. So governments counted exports, imports, because tariffs were a big part of how they paid their bills. During World War II, national income accounting was created, mostly because John Maynard Keynes, in his outline of how to pay for the war, came up with a method that you could measure potential output. And measuring potential output was critical if you wanted to know how much war production you can produce given your productivity in your economy, given your capital stock, your labor force, etc. Since the 1950s, most economic policy has been adjusting growth rates. So if unemployment goes up, try to get GDP to grow faster. If inflation goes up, try to slow down GDP. And so that's been the main policy tool. But as we've seen, this has become more of a problem now. But starting with Adam Smith, the general idea was for economists that if we want to measure someone's well-being, we measure how much they can consume. Keynesians came along and said, well, economic growth gives us employment. You have to have a job in order to consume. And so they added a step in terms of the analysis, but it's still the basic idea that if people have jobs, they can spend money, then their well-being will improve. And this is what's being increasingly brought into question, not just by fringes of economics. And when Catherine and I wrote the study in 1996, we were certainly on the margins in terms of suggesting alternative measures of well-being, but now we would certainly be well in the mainstream. The official developers, as we'll see, of national income accounting standards have fully adopted beyond GDP. Next slide. Now, for Ireland, it's even more problematic because for most countries, there's a close connection between GDP and household consumption, and that's basically what economists just assumed. But looking at table 2, we can see for GDP per capita, Ireland's number 2, 87.4% above the average of our group, the EU 14. Yet for household consumption, Ireland's more towards the middle and is only 8% above the average. And on the graph, on the side of the scatter diagram, we see that all of the countries besides Ireland and Luxembourg are they're right on top of the line, the trend line that shows the relationship between GDP per capita and household consumption. And then we have Ireland and Luxembourg as two huge outliers. So if Ireland had the same relationship based on its household consumption, which is what households are actually spending, then their GDP per capita would be, 35,000, in the 35,000 range, not at the 77,000. Next slide. So here we have the list from the SNA 2008. The SNA is the Systems of National Accounts. This is produced first in 1953 by the Statistical Commission at the United Nations, and all the main agencies participate in it. But it's developed a manual that all countries use to measure their economies. And in 1992 SNA, they pointed out that there are some problems with using GDP as a measure of well-being. In 2008, they devote a whole page to it, and here are the 5 reasons that they give that GDP can deviate from well-being, because spending doesn't always add welfare. The things that add welfare, like home production, isn't counted in GDP. The things like natural disasters, which are very good for GDP, or they can be very good for GDP, certainly aren't good for well-being. And so now the Statistical Commission, which I have been attending since 2005, 2006 at the United Nations, now they're working on the SNA 2025, and there are 7 groups working on beyond GDP. So this is a big focus of what they're working on. Next slide. Okay, so following this idea that consumption equals well-being, the World Bank has introduced a new way of measuring well-being, which they call sustainable well-being or sustainable consumption. And so if you think of your bank account and your income is how much money you earn this year. That determines what you spend this year. But in the long run, if you save, how much you save will determine what you can spend in the future. And of course, if everyone just had gold, this would be very apparent, but we don't save in what we can spend. We save in investment and et cetera into capital. And so what they've done is they've looked at the per capita capital of each country as a way of indicating how much future consumption countries can use. Now, this is definitely in development, and has been adjusting as they've been expanding it, as they've been going along. So this is certainly not as well developed as the GDP analysis. Next slide. But they now are looking at three main categories of capital. There's human capital, which is, we'll get into that in a second, but it's basically the skills of your and quality of your workforce and quantity. Natural capital, your natural resources. Produced capital. This is what economists used to call just capital. If you looked at Adam Smith all the way up until Keynes, produced capital would be machines, factories, etc. And then net foreign assets. And here we have, for our 14 countries, the total per capita wealth. And we see in Ireland, the yellow line, which is the net foreign assets, very negative. So we'll look at that in a couple of minutes. But outside of that, Ireland looks fairly typical in terms of the breakdown, a little more natural capital than most countries, but in any case. And here on the figure 4 on the right, we see how Ireland has compared with the EU average. So 1995 was below it. By 2003, it equaled the average. Then we have a bubble. We go way above it. And then we experienced the financial crisis much more severely. It goes down, and now it's starting to catch up again. Next slide. So here's where much of the bubble takes place in Ireland. So we see that our human capital goes up. Ireland's human capital goes up, way up, and then crashes down. Now, human capital is measured in this World Bank. Other World Bank studies use different measures. Is based on the present value of the future income for all workers. That should reflect how productive they are, how much they contribute to market output, things like that. But we can see that the bubble in Ireland's economy affected wages, and we have this bubble. Certainly, Irish workers didn't become really productive and then unproductive over this time period. On the right, the World Bank breaks down by gender, and we see from 95 until 2009, the wage gap, the female to male ratio, stays pretty much the same. And then the gap goes down, the ratio goes up. Women start earning a higher, go from around under 60% to 80% of what men are earning. And then we see after 2013 that going down. That is probably due to the decline in construction, which is a heavily male-dominated and often well-paying occupation. And then, as we see in more recent years, we get more towards returning to norm. Okay, next slide. Now, this is where I think the most interesting part of the World Bank analysis is, because they look at natural capital, natural resources, and then they break it down by renewable and non-renewable. And they break it down into lots of categories. So you can get fairly detailed data on renewable and non-renewable natural capital for a country. I'm sure this is still in development, and they'll get more and more accurate as they go on. But here we see Ireland's which is a very strong agricultural sector, and that's been declining. And then after the crash, start going up again. But here we see the change in Ireland is mostly renewable, going down and then starting to go up again. Next slide. Now, the produced capital, if we just look at the World Bank data, it looks like, oh, Ireland's caught up. And this is what every economist from Adam Smith on would say. If you want to catch up, accumulate capital. It means machines, factories. You'll develop the technology and you'll catch up. But when we look at the actual gross capital formation from 2010 to 2000, 19, we see that Ireland's very high rate of gross capital formation, 26% per year, which is very fast, really comes down to intellectual property. So when we look at produced capital, that includes machines, equipment, trucks, buildings, all that, but it also includes intellectual property. And that Ireland's growth in intellectual property has 12% a year is, 4 times or 3 times basically the average for all EU 14 countries. And of course, that is really a small number of countries who have decided to park their patents in Ireland. And this is just the effect that has on Irish statistics is very significant. If you take that out, then Ireland goes from the top down towards the lower middle. Next slide. And here is the net foreign accounts, and this is another effect of this of these foreign firms and earning their profits for the low taxes in Ireland, and then of course that money gets sent to the countries where the companies are located. Okay, next slide. Okay, now next slide. Now we'll look at a measure of well-being, which is closer to what we're doing and what most of the beyond GDP measures are doing. And we provide a table like this in all the studies. Some of them have even more comparisons, but they get so small you can't really see them. But we see GDP per capita. These are different numbers because it comes from the Social Progress Index 2023 measure of GDP. And we see that Ireland, again, is number 2, way above the overall average. The Social Progress Index, which we're going to look at in a minute, Ireland is just a little above the average. The Sustainable Development Goals Index, which comes from the United Nations, Jeffrey Sachs puts it out, Ireland's a little under the overall average. And then the World Happiness Index, which is a very different type, the Sustainable Development Goal Index and the Social Progress, these lots and lots of indicators. There's only 5 using the happiness based on surveys. We did a deep dive in that a couple of issues ago. And here we're just above the average. Next slide. So what we're going to do is look at the Social Progress Index and what it says about Ireland in comparison with the EU 14. The Social Progress Index was founded by a group, the most prominent being Michael Porter, who is a very famous management professor at Harvard. Anyone who teaches in business school knows about Michael Porter. And it breaks it down into 3 groups: basic needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity, each that have 19 different indicators, which they bring together, which we'll look at in a second. On the right, we see figure 13, which, again, we've had a version of this also in all of our studies, in which we look at the Social Progress Index this is updated, 2023, and we see that for the poor countries, or the developing countries under 35,000, there's a very strong connection between economic growth and the increase in the Social Progress Index, 0.66% R squared. That's very high, or 66%. That means that basically 66% of increases in GDP are reflected in increases in the Social Progress Index. Whereas when we look at the group over the developed world, we see that the R squared goes down to 0.05. And we see that that trend line is relatively flat. And it would be flatter if we took out the anomalies like Ireland and some other countries where GDP just is not accurately reflecting actual output in the country. But again, this shows that to improve well-being, you have to look at beyond just getting your economy to grow. Next slide. So we're going to do what we did for the World Bank Wealth Index, just look at how Ireland compares with the other countries. Just a breakdown, basic needs is nutrition, medical care, water and safety, housing and safety, or water and sanitation, sorry. Foundations of well-being, education, information, health, environmental quality, and then opportunities, rights, and political voice, freedom, inclusive society, and advanced education. That's what we see if we break them down. Ireland is very poor in this group in basic needs. Second to the bottom is in the middle for foundations of well-being, and it moves towards the top group in opportunity. Next slide. This is really, I think, the most interesting of the results. Here we look at Ireland over the time period that they've been producing this, 2011 to 23. And the green line, that's Ireland's Social Progress Index, and we see that's been steadily going up for the most part, as has the opportunity and foundations of well-being, a little more erratic on that. But the basic needs, the orange line, we see that has basically been trending downward. And in figure 15, we break it down into its component parts, and we see nutrition and medical care that has been improving, but we see decline in housing, which anyone who reads the news in Ireland would know about that, and water and sanitation. Again, anyone who's taken a taxi ride in Ireland in the past 15 years has heard a cab driver talk about that. At least I have a lot. And then we see safety generally improving until COVID, and that has started to go down a bit. Next slide. Okay, as these are the other two categories, the foundations of well-being and opportunity, for the most part, they've been fairly stable. Information communication has been less so, but information and communication as an issue has been less stable in terms of new developments, etc. And we see also on the opportunity where Ireland does well, the only real thing that we notice here is that inclusive society has started to go down. And that has been connected partly to LGBT issues, and then a couple other issues which we mentioned in the report. Next slide. Okay, so we look at how these three groups these categories have done from the beginning, Ireland with its competitors, and we see that for the basic needs, Ireland has gone down. Now, some other countries have gone down, but for the most part, the average has gone up. And so this is certainly an area of concern. Whereas foundations and for opportunity, Ireland's growth has been faster than the average overall, which means that it's improving at a rate similar or a little better than overall in the European Union. Next slide. Okay, so to sum it up, economic policy generally consists of the government helping those who have influence, the elites. And originally that would have been royalty, then it would have been merchants. But in democracy, it should promote what citizens want. Economic progress contributes to well-being, but the richer countries get, the weaker that connection becomes, because there are lots of aspects of flourishing. And once you've met your basic needs of food, clothing, housing, there are other things that start to play a more prominent role in improving your well-being. We've looked at two metrics, which I think give some interesting insights. They certainly are not perfectly developed. The World Bank's account, the World Bank analysis has been talking for 20 years or so about social capital. Now, certainly social capital is very important for explaining well-being and how societies and countries are doing. What the World Bank wants to do is measure social capital as a market price that contributes a value towards spending on consumption. Usually they just refer to social capital as trust. Well, it's a lot of things. Trust is part of it, but I don't know, I think includes all. And they have not made great progress in measuring social capital in a way that they could use it in these wealth accounts. However, other groups are using indicators that reflect social capital so we can see trends, but not, we cannot monetize it which I don't think will ever be done that well. The Social Progress Index gives a wide range of indicators. It was inspired by the same theories and movement that led to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a little older. So it uses a range. And the idea of the Social Progress Index, the highlight number, same thing with the same Social Development Index, same with ours, is that's really to lead you towards the specifics. And that if you want to address issues, you really need indicators that deal with those issues and not an aggregate that tells you, well, the aggregate's doing well, even though sanitation is getting worse, but that's all right because GDP is growing. No, we have found both in developing economies and in developed economies that progress comes by addressing the issues more directly than just getting an aggregate number to improve. Okay, so that's my part of the report. We'll now turn to Kavanagh.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Next, we have Dr. Catherine Kavanagh, who, like Professor Clark, has been co-authoring this report since its inception. Dr. Kavanagh will provide an overview of the index itself. She will explain the index, outline where we are making progress, and also where we are failing to live up to our commitments. The index ranks Ireland in each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, comparing our progress to that of our 14 EU peers, as well as then providing a final report card number for Ireland against the 14 European countries. So over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, John. So hi, everybody. And as John said, I'm going to talk you through the latest version of our Sustainable Progress Index itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is give a very brief overview of the data and how the index is constructed. And then I'm going to present the rankings by country. Now, first, I'm going to do them across the 3 different spheres of the economy, society, and environment, and then present the overall aggregate index itself. Now, obviously, a lot more detail is provided in the actual report itself. So next slide, please. And what we, I suppose, all know here today is that the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, and it identified 17 goals based on 169 targets and covering about over 230 indicators. And of course, the SDGs came into force in 2016. Now, Eurostat, the World Health Organization, the UN, the CSO, the OECD, they've all committed to monitoring the SDGs and collecting data that is required by countries to ensure that they do try to achieve progress on the SDGs. And also since around 2016, as John has mentioned, there are several researchers and organizations, and even the UN itself have been attempting to report on them, including ourselves, along with Social Justice Ireland. And what we've been more focused on is on tracking Ireland's performance relative to its peer countries. So if we move on to the next slide, what we'll see is, first of all, some of the information from the latest Eurostat report. Now, Eurostat produced an annual report, which is quite informative, really, because it tracks 5-year trends in the key indicators of the SDGs. Now, important to mention, they don't actually produce an index itself, but we think their report is of great value because they attempt to track how the countries are performing across a range of different indicators. And then they provide conclusions based on those indicators. They use about 100 indicators in total, and 36 of these are regarded as what's called multi-purpose indicators, meaning that they appear under the SDGs, the number of the SDGs. Now, this latest report from Eurostat says that there's been improvement in the achievement of the goals at different paces for different SDGs. And the graph here on the right-hand side is a snapshot of their conclusions. And what we see is, as we move to the top right-hand corner, Eurostat says that there's been significant progress on those SDGs in the EU. And as we move downwards to the left-hand corner, we see that there's a slight movement away from actually progress. And so what we see in this graph here is that across the EU at large, there's been significant progress in the areas of SDG 1, which is about poverty, decent work, SDG 8, gender inequality, SDG 5, moderate progress on maybe the middle type of, the middle range for a lot of the goals, but certainly a movement away from progress on specifically 2 SDGs, which are SDG 15 and SDG 17. So then there's another, if we move to the next slide, please, then there's another, I suppose, body of work, which is done by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues in a Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Institute. And their work over the years has really complemented the work of Eurostat. Now, their latest report provides a country profile of 193 countries, including many of the less developed countries. And here they do calculate an index for each country, and they try to estimate how each country is faring on achievement of each SDG. Now, they produce what are called country-specific dashboards from this data to provide guidelines to policymakers in the areas of specific poor progress. Now, this graph is again taken from the latest SDSN report by Jeffrey Sachs. The color codes identify progress made under SDGs. So a green indicator here implies achievement, and yellow, orange, and red indicate increasing distance from the SDG. So what we see here, I suppose, is that certainly for Ireland, there is major, I suppose, challenges for 4 particular SDGs, number 2, 12, 13, and 17. And they would suggest also that there are still, significant challenges on 3 other SDGs, the orange ones here, 6, 7, and 14. So a lot of the kind of environmental indicators or goals cropping up there. I should say as well, in order to be classified as a green, each single indicator has to be achieved in order to get a green light. So, and the other thing just to note, I suppose, is certainly there's improvements in the area of poverty, but remember that the SDSN also covers the less developed countries, and a lot of their indicators are more, I suppose, applicable to those less developed countries. So if we move on now, we'll take a look at the next slide, where we focus a little bit more on our own report. So the first thing to mention is, as John alluded to, our purpose is to focus on the EU 14. So we're measuring performance of each country relative to what we consider to be the peer countries. And these are countries with a sort of similar level of development. Now, there's an extensive data set required in order to produce our index. And we try, insofar as possible, to rely on the official indicators that are produced by both the UN, which is their global indicator framework from 2017. And again, that's updated on an annual basis. And also the EU indicator set, which is produced and updated on an annual basis as well. Now, the thing about the EU indicator set is that Eurostat provide indicators that are probably more relevant to EU policies and initiatives. So as far as possible, we try to incorporate our indicators from both those sources. If we move on then to the next slide. I should say that there are probably a number of additional rules that help guide our selection for our 14 countries. The first is relevance and applicability, quality, coverage, and most recent available. So we want to ensure that we've data on each of the countries for each of the indicators, that the quality is as reliable as possible, and it's relevant and applicable insofar as it's either very closely aligned to the UN indicators for under the SDGs, or it is an exact match. Now, on that basis, then, we arrive at 83 indicators across our 17 goals. The good news is that we have a minimum of 4 indicators for most of the SDGs, and the exception is 2 particular ones that are important. SDG 13, we have to rely on 2 indicators given data availability. And for SDG 14, we just have 3 indicators, which is far from ideal. But as I said, given our criteria of data selection, we have to work with what we have. So if we move on then to the next slide, I'll just briefly mention our methodology, which is covered in a lot more detail in the actual report. Now, our method is very similar to that used by Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues since 2016. The first step in constructing the index is to rescale the data, because this makes it comparable across all countries. All indicators are expressed in ascending order, so that a better performance on an indicator always implies a higher SDG value. So for example, 100 is the best possible measure, 0 being the worst. And then what we do is we examine our SDGs under the 3 dimensions of economy, society, and government. Now, we know that all of the goals are interdependent and interconnected. However, we think it's useful to examine them under these 3 different spheres. And finally, then, we aggregate across all the 17 goals to arrive at what we call our one measure of the Sustainable Progress Index. So the other thing just to note is that each indicator is weighted equally in the SDG, as are the SDGs. And this is important because it is, I suppose, closely aligned to the UN's observation that these are universal goals, which involve the entire world, and they are integrated and indivisible. So let's move on then, and we'll take a look at some of the results. So first up is our economy index. Now, this index is computed using 2 goals, SDG 8 and SDG 9. And I should perhaps just preface this with, of course, there is no significant sort of agreement as to what is classified as economy or society or environment. So we base our judgment on what we think certainly would incorporate most of the elements that would capture the theme of the economy. So we rely on SDG 8 and SDG 9. And here's the ranking of our countries. And what we see is that the economy score comes in 9th place. So what we see is some of the Scandinavian countries topping the ranking there. But just in terms of how we arrive at that, SDG 8, remember, is decent work in economic growth. So that particular SDG is calculated using 6 indicators. We use measures such as GDP, employment, low pay, the NEAT rate, and accidents at work. Now, of course, Ireland scores very well on GDP per capita. In fact, it's second only to Luxembourg. But when we include all of the other indicators that I've just mentioned there, as I say, the SDG score actually comes in 7th place. Okay, so more on the actual individual SDGs just later. But in terms of mentioning SDG 9, remember SDG 9 calls for building resilient and sustainable infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and emphasizes research and innovation. So for this goal specifically, we use 6 indicators, covering everything from R&D expenditure to the number of researchers, patents, and so on. And we know that, for example, a key indicator there is expenditure on research and development. And as a percentage of GDP, Ireland actually ranks the lowest in the sample of countries on that measure. It's 0.96%. And Sweden, Austria, Germany, and Belgium are the exceptions. They score much higher on this indicator. They all have expenditure as a percentage of GDP greater than the target of 3%. So as I say, Ireland specifically scores the lowest on that particular indicator. So our rank overall on SDG 9 comes in at 10. So combining those two, as I say, for our economy index gives us a ranking of 9 for the economy. Now we'll move on to the next slide, which captures our society index. So the society index is calculated drawing on 8 SDGs, and we see what those are there on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, the combined score for all our SDGs, based on all of the different indicators, shows Ireland halfway kind of in the middle of the ranking there at number 7. So number 7. Now, it's a relatively favorable position. It's driven perhaps by strong performance on the education theme, which I'll mention in a moment. and relatively good performance on the peace and justice goal, which is number 16, and also good health and well-being, which is SDG 3. So for SDG 1, for example, we use 3 indicators to capture the theme of no poverty. Ireland scores very well on the poverty rate itself, but it does less well on other measures of poverty. In terms of SDG 2, no hunger, of course, achieving healthy diets and ensuring agricultural systems remain productive and sustainable are the key challenges for this goal in the EU context. And at EU level, including in Ireland, trends in the area of malnutrition remain unfavourable. Really, there's been a clear rise in the share of obese people in the EU since 2014. We've seen similar trends again in Ireland, and Ireland, in fact, has one of the highest rates of obesity among the EU 14. As far as SDG 3 is concerned, good health and well-being, within this, at the EU context, it tends to be characterised at the EU level, at least, by strong progress over the last 5 years or so, despite COVID-19. And significant progress has been made in almost all health-related indicators. And what we see is that there seems to be a similar trend being seen in Ireland, because, and again, the indicators specifically for this SDG include things like life expectancy, subjective well-being, indicators such as death due to chronic diseases, incidence of alcohol, incidence of smoking, and so on. Now, we score relatively well, again, kind of in the middle of the rankings on SDG 3 in 6th place. And again, as we kind of, I suppose, expect at this stage, the Scandinavian countries tend to top the ranking. Moving on to SDG 4, which is all about quality education. Now, education is seen as one of the key goals in meeting all of the other SDGs, and it aims at reducing poverty, inequality, gender equality. It contributes to growth, employment, productivity, innovation, competitiveness, and healthier lifestyles, and so on. Our measure of SDG 4 here reflects education at all levels of life, from preschool right up to adult level and lifelong learning. And this is one of the SDGs that Ireland scores particularly well. And in fact, Ireland is ranked first of the 14 countries on SDG 14 for quality education. Moving on to SDG 5, which is all about gender equality. Our goal here consists of 5 different indicators, somewhat mixed results for this particular goal. It comes in at ranked 10th place rather, overall out of the 14 countries. Now, this is despite some improvements. We're below average on indicators such as the share of women in national parliament and the share of women in senior management. On a positive note, the gender gap has been reversed, certainly in the area of education at least, meaning that women are ahead of men in terms of education. And Ireland is actually ranked first on that particular indicator. Now, reducing the gender pay gap is one of the key priorities of gender policies, as we know, at both EU and national levels. And certainly as far as Ireland is concerned, we are below the EU 27 for the gender gap. So a positive note there at 9.9%. SDG 10 is all about reduced inequalities. We use 4 indicators to capture that specific theme. And again, kind of a mixed performance there. We're ranked in the middle of the rankings. For SDG 16, which is all about peace, justice, and strong institutions, our analysis here shows that Ireland is a relatively safe society with, compared to at least the other countries, a low number of deaths associated with homicide, assault, lower perceived occurrence of crime, violence, and vandalism. And relative to the other countries, Ireland comes in at a fairly positive number, fifth place for SDG 16. And finally then to SDG 17, which is a very important goal, which is all about partnership for the goals. So, I mean, we strongly believe that a strong commitment to global partnership and cooperation is critical for the achievement of Agenda 2030. And regarding one of the indicators, we use 4 indicators, but one of the key ones is ODA, and Ireland's contribution of 0.3% of gross national income is well below the EU average. I suppose it's important to mention that as a member of the EU, Ireland is clearly a long way off of meeting its commitment on this goals. So combining other EU indicators for this measure, Ireland is actually ranked last on SDG 17. So what we see is that the society overall gives a ranking of 7th place for Ireland, so in the middle of the rankings, but definitely a lot of pluses and minuses in there, which definitely means that we need to look a little bit more closely at the actual data and at the indicators themselves. So then we move on to the final, I suppose, theme, which is the environment. So this is the final leg of the stool, and country scores and rankings for the environment are shown here in this slide. And we draw on 7 different goals shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. And Ireland overall on the environment theme is ranked in 11th place out of the 14 countries. Let's take a look at some of the key points, I suppose. SDG 6 is all about sanitation, water quality, and water efficiency. We draw on 4 indicators to capture that theme. The analysis suggests that for Ireland, there is significant room for improvement there. We're ranked 11th on SDG 6. For affordable and clean energy, which is the theme of SDG 7, Ireland's CO2 emissions from energy fuel combustion, they are one of the highest in the actual sample. The share of renewable energy is one of the lowest relative to our peers. And the final energy consumption in household per capita, although it has fallen since 2000, it's now below the EU average. So a little bit of a positive news there. However, it's one of the SDGs where we again score quite poorly, and we're ranked last on SDG 7. Sustainable cities and communities is the theme of SDG 11, and it includes things like sustainable transport, adverse environmental impacts, and so on. We do well on this SDG. We're ranked in 2nd place on SDG 11. On SDG 12, which is about responsible production and consumption, we know that economic growth has long been linked to an increase in resource and energy consumption. I suppose the main goal of, the main aim of SDG 12 is about doing more and better with less. We use 5 indicators. We continue, however, to see that Ireland is generating a significant amount of municipal waste per capita. We're in 11th place on that indicator. Recycling rates of municipal waste and circular material use, again, we don't do too well on those indicators. Combining, however, all our indicators for SDG 12 gives us a ranking of 10th place on that SDG. Moving on then to SDG 13, which is all about climate action. We use only 2 indicators. Recall I said that that isn't ideal, but we use what we can. We use measures of greenhouse gases because that's what Eurostat use. And we also use a measure of the effective carbon rate, which is also known as the carbon pricing score. Now, despite improvements in this SDG over the recent past, the overall score for SDG 13 puts us in 9th place. SDG 14, all about the life below water, and obviously the conservation of oceans by safeguarding and ensuring sustainable use of them is the main aim of SDG 14. It's one of those goals where data is not as available as we would like. So we've only 3 indicators which we use. And on that basis, Ireland comes in 8th place. For life on land, similar to, I suppose, SDG, monitoring this SDG is one of the ones that's a little bit more problematic. There are pluses and minuses too among the indicators. The share of protected terrestrial areas and freshwater areas, you know, gives Ireland a relatively good ranking. The score on the Red List Index, which estimates biodiversity loss, is much less favourable. And of course, the share of land dedicated for forestry use is very low in Ireland, and it's well below the EU average. Our overall score on SDG 15 is ranked 7th. So overall, we have the environmental index getting a score of 11. So the next slide then just really summarizes all of those different numbers. So again, we see the economy coming in 9th place, society in 7th place, and the environment in 11th place. So it's a useful little table because what we see is Ireland certainly does well on some of the SDGs. So we see number 4, number 11, and number 16. We don't do too badly either on SDG 3 and SDG 10. However, we're kind of in the middle of the ranking for a lot of the other SDGs. And we still see that there are some significant challenges ahead, particularly for some of the goals representing the environment. I suppose the important point to note at this stage is this is very much in line with what Eurostat and Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues have found for Ireland. So now, if we move on to my final slide at least, this is, I suppose, a kind of a nice way of summarizing how are we doing overall? Where do we stand relative to our other peer countries? And so our Sustainable Progress Index, as I say, it's a composite measure. It's based on all of the 17 SDGs. The real benefit, and it is probably the real benefit of just this single measure, is that it provides a simple report card to track Ireland's overall performance on the SDGs. Countries that we compare to our peer countries, which are at a similar level of development. And what we see here is overall, Ireland is ranked in 8th place. So middle of the rankings again, I suppose. And what we see as in previous years again, is that the Scandinavian countries, along with the Netherlands, tend to top the ranking. That's something that we've seen in several of our previous reports. Okay, so I suppose enough now of the numbers stuff for me. Let's see what all this really means on the ground. So I'm going to pass you now on to John, who'll talk you through some of the really important policy considerations.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And as you said, the particular utility of measuring progress is that knowing where we stand allows us to take action. So our report concludes with a suite of policy recommendations intended to support government to better implement the Sustainable Development Goals. After I've outlined some of the policy implications of this year's report, we have time for Q&A or on anything that's been raised by either Professor Clark, Dr. Kavanagh, or myself. So feel free to pop any questions you might have into the Q&A function. Okay, so we'll have a look then at policy implications. We've heard a lot about well-being throughout this presentation and the various metrics that can be drawn upon to measure well-being. In recent years, the government has developed a well-being framework. So the vision and goals for the framework laid out by government in 2022 are as follows: to enable people to have purposeful lives that support good physical and mental health, enabling the development of skills across the life cycle and providing a good standard of living, ensure a sustainable sense of place, including an appropriate and safe place to live, and protection of Ireland's environment, climate and biodiversity, and to preserve balance, inclusivity and equality of opportunity across society with open, effective government, empowering families, friends and communities to grow and connect meaningfully engage. So this framework is made up of 11 dimensions, and if we just switch to the next slide, they're broken down accordingly to subjective well-being, mental and physical health, income and wealth, knowledge, skills and innovation, housing and the built environment, environment, climate and biodiversity, safety and security, work and job quality, time use, connections, community and participation, civic engagement, trust and cultural expression. And progress on each is measured using multiple indicators. And it's very clear to see that there's a natural complementarity between many of the 11 dimensions and the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we just switch over to the next slide, it's also worth pointing out that as well as there being a complement between the SDGs and the wellbeing framework, we've also been able to map this framework and the SDGs onto Social Justice Ireland's own set of 5 overarching policy outcomes needed to renew the social contract, namely a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. And they're the sort of the 5 overarching policy outcomes that we believe are essential in order to create a just society and to renew the social contract. So if you switch to the next slide, please. As you can see here, the well-being dimensions of work and job quality, together with knowledge, skills, and innovation, sit under Social Justice Ireland's outcome of a vibrant economy. Subjective well-being, mental and physical health, housing in the built environment, and community and participation all sit under the policy outcome of decent services and infrastructure. The dimension of wealth and income comes under the outcome of just taxation. Safety and security, together with civic engagement, trust, and cultural expression, belong under our policy outcome of good governance. And finally, the environment, climate, and biodiversity, along with time use, comes under Social Justice Ireland's policy outcomes of sustainability. So moving on from that, as Dr. Kavanagh explained, this year we've ranked 8th out of 14 in the Sustainable Progress Index, the SPI, for 2024. And I suppose we're holding the position we achieved last year, which in itself is an improvement in Ireland's ranking of 10th place in 2022. However, this still leaves us in the bottom half of the EU 14 peer group. Admittedly, it's at the top of the bottom half, but it's still not in the top half. So what do we need to do to make progress? So as mentioned, in terms of an overarching policy agenda, we need a renewal of the social contract, which has been broken for far too long. And unfortunately, in recent times, the politics of hostility and exclusion that have really been coming to the fore represent the resulting unraveling of the social fabric. So government must focus on 5 policy outcomes highlighted, and to do so with a sense of mission that recognises that each policy area must be developed in tandem with one another. This approach recognises that all 5 policy areas, all 11 dimensions of the wellbeing framework, and all 17 SDGs, each form interlocking and mutually supporting systems. And so a renewal of the social contract relies on this. It also relies on not just policy being made by government, but meaningful social dialogue in which everyone is able to participate. And that there needs to be appropriate structures for that dialogue across all local areas. So the report outlines policy recommendations at both national and local levels, and they're divided under the policy outcomes of the new social contract, and then subdivided under the heading of the 11 dimensions of government's wellbeing framework. And if we just switch over to the next slide. Okay, so you can see the first here under the outcome of a vibrant economy, and then that's split under numerous wellbeing indicators, the first of which is work and job quality. So our recommendations at the national level here is to implement a refundable tax credit system to support the working poor, and to recognise the challenges of long-term unemployment and precarious employment, and adopt targeted policies to address these. That's addressing the issue of the SDG 1, no poverty, addressing good jobs and economic growth. We look at the need to have major investment focused on prioritising initiatives that strengthen social infrastructure, including a comprehensive school building programme, as well as supporting widespread adoption of a living wage so that low-paid workers receive an adequate income. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. As well as addressing both of those, we then move on to the wellbeing indicator number 4, knowledge and skills, which also feeds into a vibrant economy, and particularly quality education. And here it's clear that there needs to be improvement of educational outcomes for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. We need to commit to reducing class sizes. And as was noted in the report, one of the areas where we might be falling down on quality education is in terms of lifelong learning. And there's a number of policy recommendations here, one of which is to revise our lifelong learning target to reach 20%, to meet the digital green transition challenges. in order to do so, to develop an integrated skills development, digital transition, vocational training, apprenticeship and reskilling strategy, and to fully resource adult literacy for life. The next slide, please. So the next area policy outcome we talk about is decent services and infrastructure. And feeding into this is well-being number one on subjective well-being. And again, this is fed into by SDG 1, SDG 3, and SDG 10. Some of the policy recommendations we have is to support policies that enhance the standard of living people who are most marginalized, including people with a disability, to specifically address poverty among people with disability. With regards to good health, we're looking at the need to increase educational campaigns promoting health, targeting particularly people who are poor, acknowledging that a preventative approach saves money in the long run, as well as saving people's well-being. And in terms of reduced inequalities, we need to work to eliminate barriers faced by people with disabilities in accessing basic services such as housing, healthcare, and education. If we continue the next slide. Yeah, so the also feeding into decent services and infrastructure is well-being indicator number 2 as part of the government's well-being framework, addressing mental and physical health. And in this, we recommend that we need to fund research on food poverty, and we need to expand the hot school meals program. Next slide, please. Again, feeding into this in terms of good health and well-being, SDG number 3, we look at recommendations including, announce budgetary allocations, ensure that budgetary allocations are valid, realistic, and transparent. And unfortunately, time and time again in the healthcare system, the budget has not proven to be realistic. We also need to see a complete rollout of the community health networks and increase the availability of quality primary care and social care services, and ensure medical card coverage for all people who are vulnerable. And as you can see, there's a long list of recommendations here. We won't go through each of them in this presentation. If you go to the next slide, please. Also feeding into decent services and infrastructure is housing and the built environment, and particularly to address SDG number 1, no poverty. We need to introduce an equity scheme for borrowers in long-term mortgage arrears, and also increase the provision of housing first accommodation for families in emergency accommodation. Continue to the next slide. Addressing SDG number 8 for sustainable cities and communities. We need to set a target of 20% of all housing stock for social housing and achieve this through building more social housing. Ensure that no state land suitable for housing is sold by a local authority or state agency, and address the affordability through a supply side initiative, such as new methodologies and procurement processes, rather than demand side supplies. And again, there's many more recommendations on this issue that you can read in the report. If you continue on, please, to the next slide. Also feeding into this issue of decent services and infrastructure is connections, community, and participation. And this is all very related to SDG 16 for peace and justice. And again, central to this is the need for a national economic and social dialogue and partnership to include all 5 pillars in that dialogue, to ensure that all voices are heard and included, all stakeholders, and to restore funding to the community and voluntary pillar, to broaden discussion beyond pay and taxation. And again, there's a host of other recommendations there that you can read. Okay, if you move on to the next slide, please. So the next policy area that we address is just taxation. And this can be addressed under Wellbeing Indicator 3, Income and Wealth. And in addressing this, we have policy recommendations that are relevant to SDG 1, end poverty, to SDG 4, quality education, and 5, gender equality. We recommend immediately increasing the core social welfare rates by €13 and move towards benchmarking welfare rates to average weekly earnings. We also recommend adopting a targets aimed at reducing poverty among particularly vulnerable groups such as children, lone parents, jobless households, and those in social rented housing. We recommend adopting and implementing a national financial literacy strategy and also introducing a universal state social welfare pension. Okay, and the next slide, please. The next policy outcome that we recommend focusing on is good governance. And again, that can be fed into by well-being indicator number 7, or safety and security, which addresses SDG 5 and SDG 10, gender equality and reduced inequalities. We recommend that we need to follow a ratification of the Istanbul Convention, or rather following our ratification of the Istanbul Convention. Ireland is obligated to have 472 places for victims of domestic and gender-based violence. However, we are falling far short of this target. We also recommend that we fully implement the recommendations of the Commission for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination within a reasonable time frame, and also fully implement the recommendations of the 2019 Trafficking in Persons report. Next slide, please. Also feeding into good governance is civic engagement and cultural expression. And of course, this goes beyond our own shores and our responsibilities to the wider world. And we recommend increasing ODA, or Overseas Development Assistance, as a percentage of GNI, with a move towards the UN target of 0.7% of GNI by 2028, in time for the 2030 deadline for the SDGs. We also recommend adopting targets, recommend that government adopt targets and a reporting system for sustainable development goals. And again, this all feeds into the idea that all of this needs to be, as we're already doing today, measuring and following through. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. The last area that we focus on is sustainability, last but certainly not least. And this is relevant to indicators 6 on the environment, climate and biodiversity. With regards to SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation, we recommend continuing to provide support and advice to farmers to improve water quality under Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advice Programme. With regards to SDG 7 for affordable and clean energy, we recommend upgrading the national grid and invest in infrastructure necessary to support a transition to renewable energy. The next slide, please. With regards to SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, we have a number of recommendations here, but one of which would be to reintroduce the windfall gains tax at 80%. Another would be to introduce a circular economy package for Ireland across all areas of economic activity. With regards to climate, SDG 13, addressing climate action, we want to see the establishment of a just transition and adaptation dialogue to ensure rural areas are not disproportionately impacted by low carbon policies and are supported to meet the challenges posed by the future of work. Additionally, we recommend developing a comprehensive mitigation and transition programme to transition to a low carbon economy. And again, there's many more suggestions there. And if we move on, please. Yeah, so also feeding into this, SDG 14, life below water, and SDG 15, life on land. We recommend fully implementing the National Integrated Maritime Plan. We also recommend increasing forestation of native trees and to reduce the planting of Sitka spruce. Also to ensure that sustainable agricultural policy, sustainable land management, and short supply chains for farmers and consumers form the basis of future agricultural policy. And the next slide, please. And sort of coming to an end, the last indicator, well-being indicator that's relevant to sustainability is time use. And this is particularly relevant to SDG 10, reduced inequalities. And again, particularly with this, we want to recognize that the term work is not synonymous with the concept of paid employment. Everybody has a right to work, i.e. to contribute to his or her own development and that of the community and the wider society. This, however, should not be confined to job creation. We need to get to a situation where we realize that work and jobs are not the same thing, and there needs to be appropriate recognition. And part of that is giving greater recognition to the work carried out by carers in Ireland and to introduce policy reforms to reduce the financial and emotional pressures on carers. So, as I said, there's a whole suite of policy recommendations there that we don't have time to go through in detail, but they're all in the report. and there will be an opportunity for you to download that report at the end of this webinar. So we'll now move on to the Q&A section, and I'll just have a check to see if there are any questions for myself, for Professor Clark, and for Dr. Kavanagh. And if you have any other questions, you have time to add a few as well before we wrap up. So the first question here is, why isn't median human capital measure used instead of an average or a mean, i.e. using the 50th percentile, which should remove the skewed effect of Ireland's tax haven status, at least as a simple starting place? This question comes from John Barrymore, and it's certainly relevant to yourself, Charlie, and your section.
Yeah, no, this is a very good point. And I think the answer to this is that I don't know if they can do that now. These are fairly new in the development stage. I'm old enough to remember poverty research in the 1980s when I started out as a graduate student. And when you look at how it developed in the 90s and on, especially in terms of micro data sets and what we have now, it's just not even comparable. But back then, you used averages because you can count the population, you can count the income, and then you can figure out the average. And I think that's where they are here. The use of household budget surveys and that's where we get most of our micro data sets from, is being pushed. Very few countries do it every year. But it is, I mean, that we will be able to do this, maybe in 10 years or so, because that's the direction they're going in.
Very clear. Another question here from also yourself, Charlie, from Colette Bennett, who says, well done on the report. She asks, how are the SDGs grouped for basic needs, foundations, and opportunity?
Yeah, and the Social Progress Index divides into these groups. We use economy, society, and the environment partly as a way to really emphasize the environment. So they have the environment really just one category as part of foundations. And, I spend a good deal of time at the UN, at the Statistical Commissions, and also the Sustainable and Social Development committees. And climate change is a serious threat that has to be given a great deal of focus and not just one, because as we get closer to these disaster tipping points, we run the risk of really overwhelming basic needs and all the other factors, as just dealing with adverse weather and all the problems that we're having, just starting right now. So I think you can rearrange these things in many ways. And as Catherine pointed out, many of the SDGs fit multiple categories, because in some ways you're really making arbitrary lines and defining what is the economy, what is society, and but we can't think in this multi-connected way as humans yet. So we divided it into categories that we understand and that we can develop policy on. And I think really keeping the environment separate instead of just having as part of one is very useful right now. The next one on the ESG reporting, I'm actually working with a group of business professors. I teach at a business school, and there's a lot of interest in this. But the real issue is that companies report what they're required to report. And there are rules on how they could use ESG, so that if a company runs, if a publicly traded company in the United States enacts policies that they specifically say this is for maximizing social return instead of return on investors' capital, they'll get sued very quickly. And so there's been a movement to try to create space. And I believe there is a certain group of companies that have that kind of freedom. But really, what I think needs to be done is eventually embedding all these costs and benefits into the reports that companies use to figure out what is their profitability, so that they're not getting profits based on the fact that they're not paying for all the costs that they created elsewhere, that their profits are not just captured because they made someone else pay for it, but that they're actually based on their addition to the net overall addition. And since companies have such an outsized influence on how these rules are set, this is the long game. Something that's being pushed by UN Prime, which is a group of businesses working at the UN, and half the debate of the UN Prime is how much real progress do they want, or how much is this sort of like greenwashing, trying to make it look like we're doing these things, but still emphasizing return on investment for shareholders. Because companies spend so much money just buying their own shares, which if they put that money into actually investing in sustainable processes, they'd have a serious effect on improving the situation.
And on that question then about improving the situation, we have a question here from Kevin O'Sullivan of the Irish Times. Given we are at the midway point in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, what is the panel's overall view on the chances of full adoption by 2030? It seems that critical goals are unlikely to be achieved. And also, what can be done to improve awareness and understanding of the value of the SDGs in Ireland? So I suppose a two-pronged question there. Oh, you're muted there, Catherine.
Sorry, yeah, I might just come in on that one initially anyway. Well, I suppose, there's a lot of good work being done. Let's be honest, there's a lot of good work being done in terms of trying to get that message out there that the SDGs are important. And as your question has correctly stated, we are halfway through. So it is an important time, I suppose, to take stock and to see where we are going with the achievement. I suppose, look, like, it's not to say that there hasn't been improvement. Certainly, I think, we're comparing Ireland relative to our peer countries. And it's important to note that even though, we're still, we're at number 8 or whatever, that means that we're halfway down the ranking and have been since last year, but we are making progress. Other countries are improving too. And, the thing is, I think that there are a lot of, I think the work of social justice is very important to trying to kind of get that message out there and emphasize the importance of the SDGs. But there are, I think, a lot of things being done on the ground. I know that John Barrymore in the UCC, who is the newly appointed manager of the SDSN network in Ireland, which I think is a great initiative. Really, the purpose of the SDSN new network in Ireland is to try and promote sustainable development. And networks like these are hugely important. And they're hugely, I think, helpful in terms of getting those messages out there. And there's a lot of interesting things. I spoke with John just recently. There's a lot of interesting things that are being proposed at ground level. So, at the level of the county councils and at the level of kind of real networks on the ground. And I think that's very important, because there's one thing, I suppose, of having an emphasis on the SDGs at national level. And I think that's important, but it has to really happen on the ground. And I can say that from my own experience, even within UCC, we're beginning to see a lot more awareness and a lot more, I suppose, appetite for taking the SDGs seriously, particularly as we are kind of halfway through. That said, as your commentator has correctly said, we are struggling definitely with some of the SDGs, particularly the environmental ones. I think that's been well documented elsewhere. We're doing much better on things like the societal goals. And we mentioned things like, education and specifically. So there's still a lot of room for improvement, but I suppose the key thing I would say is that let's not assume that there hasn't been any progress made. There has been progress, certainly in terms of taking this SDGs seriously, taking them on board. But the real test will be to see, can we really embed them at local level? And I think that should make a change. And as for whether we'll succeed I mean, all we can do is keep plugging away, you know. They're important. They are hugely relevant, I think, for all of us going forward. So, you know, let's not give up just yet anyway.
Yep, absolutely. And you mentioned the SDSN, and other Coalition 2030 are also doing very important work around promoting the SDGs. Charlie,
can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just not to talk too much about business schools, but many business schools are accredited by AAS, the American Association for Collegiate Business Schools. Well, I think UCC is as well.
UCC is credited, AACSB. That's right.
Yeah. And so, and they used to have a long list of categories. They cut down the list, but then they added one in which the SDGs play a big role. So business schools now have to be able to demonstrate how they are addressing or bringing the SDGs and the SDG framework into their different programs. And one way that it's being done is in macroeconomics. Some of the newer textbooks actually have sections on beyond GDP and sections on the SDGs and alternative ways of measuring progress. And so, you know, business schools are emphasizing it. It will become more and more part of the formation of business leaders going into the future. But the last point on halfway through, again, being old, I was around when we started the MDGs, which was really a radical change. Instead of just saying we're going to push economic growth as they had in all the decades of development, the UN had 4 decades of development programs. And they moved to this where they had, here are 8 targets we're going to try to hit. Halfway through that, we had the financial crisis where, you know, I remember Joseph Stiglitz giving a presentation at the UN where it couldn't have been more depressing. Yet, in the end, by 2015, many of the sub-Saharan African countries met the MDGs. And, you know, I think humans wait to the last minute to do everything. So I am not as pessimistic that the goals won't be met, particularly since the environmental factors are just becoming more costly to societies, and you know the will get greater and greater. At least there's the hope of that.
And maybe turn that question of will and political will. I have a question here from Megan Carmody from Coalition 2030. She says, thank you for the presentation and your ongoing work on this fantastic report, which will be very useful, especially in this year, 18 months of elections. She has 2 questions. One, would you consider in the future weighting rather, the areas in order to reflect the concept of strong sustainability versus weak sustainability? Maybe that's a question particularly for you, Catherine, although Charlie might want to come in there too. And 2, does this report take into account spillover effects of Ireland's policies, e.g. embodied carbon, embodied slavery? She says, I know this is a weakness of Ireland's well-being framework.
Okay, I might come in there in relation to the first question in terms of the weighting. Yeah, I mean, there is there's no agreement about weighting any of the SDGs, and that's the simple fact. And it's very hard to, you know, I mean, I suppose you'd be using a certain amount of judgment and sort of, you know, a more subjective, I suppose, perspective if you were to weight them. That said, I think, you know, possibly there could be something like the commentator said in terms of weak sustainability, strong sustainability. I mean, certainly we try to make sure that we, insofar as possible, adhere to the idea of the UN, which is all goals are treated equally and they all should be perceived as, you know, integrated but indivisible and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's something certainly worth considering. I definitely think in terms of doing it, maybe just to identify, countries that are more sustainable than others. The other point about the spillovers, no, our report doesn't include spillovers, but I can tell you that the SDSN work by Jeffrey Sachs, and to some extent only very recently by Eurostat, they attempt to take account of spillover effects, but not in any sort of quantitative way. I mean, it's mainly more done on a qualitative basis. I do recall a few years ago when we were experimenting with our SDG progress indicators, we included, I think, a measure of Ireland as a tax haven. And of course, Ireland scored really, really badly on that. And if I remember, there was another, I can't remember what the other one was, but anyway, we kind of got criticized quite extensively for including things that were, essentially subjective measures, whilst at the same time they were survey based. So yeah, I suppose we do try to make sure we stick to what the UN have set out as the main kind of indicators and the main approach. But, who's to say that won't change going forward, that there will be some sort of, additions to it.
Yeah, certainly. And Charlie?
Yeah, I think at our first presentation, we got a question on weighting back in the 90s. Yes, one of the things that we want to do is not make the final number the important number, because we think it's valuable, particularly for the service that we're providing, is covering a lot of different data sources, and that different groups will be interested in. And that hopefully different policy advocates will see, oh, this is something that we could use in pushing government to do more on housing, or that breaking down into individual categories instead of just one aggregate number, I think is very important. Ultimately, weighing what's important or more important has to be a political decision, because that will determine where government puts their funds and where consumers put funds. I mean, but it has to be something that is not by Catherine and I just doing it, but I would point out that the OECD has their own sort of well-being indicator, and I have my students use it because one of the things you can do is you can change all the weights and see how it impacts it. So, I mean, so it's a possibility that, in terms of as an educational tool, you can show how if we put more importance on housing, how does that affect what our aggregate numbers look like, or how we look overall at how Ireland's doing. And once you start doing stuff like that, then you start getting more towards also thinking about and including spillover effects.
Yeah.
Yes, Catherine, were you going to?
No, I was just going to say, sorry. No, I'd agree with what Charlie was saying there. No, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead on the chat there, and I saw a good question also from Sean Healy. So would it be okay if I address that?
I was just going to bring it exactly. Yeah, yes.
Absolutely. It's the no poverty. Yeah. And I absolutely agree with what Sean is saying there. He's essentially saying that, we look as if we're doing well on poverty. Certainly, if you look at the SDSN from Jeffrey Sachs, Ireland is green, and green means that we have achieved, the goal of no poverty. But of course, that's not true, because most of the indicators that are used by Jeffrey Sachs are obviously the ones from the UN, and they're 100% more applicable to really, less developed countries. And they don't at all, I suppose, relate over to the European countries, and not least Ireland. So on one measure, and this is why we try to incorporate, different indicators, and certainly we've done that here, I think. And I mean, as Sean correctly says there, the goal is no poverty. And if you look at one of the key measures, which is poverty after taxes and whatever that the OECD produce, Ireland looks really good on that. But however, when you include things like people who are severely deprived, materialistically deprived, and you also include low intensity households, it brings that ranking right down. So I think our ranking for sustainable or for no poverty was ranked at, I think it was number 8. So that just gives you an indication that it is important to include measures that are more applicable to the developed countries. So there's no point comparing Ireland, for example, to, I don't know, Chad or Nigeria or anything like that. We need to really kind of measure what poverty means. And I suppose from that point of view, it is important to kind of make sure that those kind of social goals are getting as due recognition as the environmental goals. The SDGs are just not all about the environment. I think that's an important point.
Absolutely. So possibly on that point, I'm just looking at the time now, and we're just past 2:30, which is time. There are a few more questions in the Q&A, but I'm not sure if we have time to get through them. So thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you very much, Catherine. And thank you very much to those who have tuned in today for the launch of the report. And there's an opportunity now for you to download it and read it in detail. It's been popped into the chat as a downloadable link. So it just remains for me to say again, thanks very much, Professor Charles Clarke, St. John's University, New York, and Dr. Catherine Kavanagh, University College Cork. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for tuning in today.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody. Bye.